Welcome to the Texas Conflict Coach radio program. If you've ever experienced or engaged in destructive or unresolved conflict, then you know it leads to broken relationships, distrust, and damaging results. Our program will help you manage and resolve conflict effectively with strategies, valuable resources, and support. Since 2009, our radio program hosted guest experts from around the globe sharing their perspectives, experiences, and expertise while giving you food for thought. If you can't listen live, then download and listen to any of our 300-plus podcasts in our library at texasconflictcoach.com. So sit back, relax, or join the conversation every Tuesday evening, or tweet us at TXConflictCoach.
Well, good evening, everyone. We already have quite a few people in our chat room, our studio, and in our Twitter feed. Thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for joining us for our Workplace Conflict series this month of May. So we all know conflict in the workplace is inevitable and toxic, especially in difficult workplaces that are not. And sadly, most HR professionals don't know this. They think mediation is not for them, when in fact they are effectively mediating all the time. And in our episode tonight, Mediation, a vital tool for HR professionals, we're going to learn why this tool is vital for your career and also your workplace. Now, tonight's guest is John Ford, and he is the founder of the HR Mediation Academy and the author of Peace at Work, the HR Manager's Guide to Workplace Mediation. He mediates, trains, and consults to organizations that have accepted the inevitability of conflict and are seeking to approach it with greater clarity and confidence. He was the managing editor of mediate.com for a number of years, from 1999 to 2011, and he was also the past president of the Association for Dispute Resolution of Northern California. I'm honored to have known John for a long time through the Association for Conflict Resolution, and John, I'm really glad that you're here with us tonight.
Thanks, Patty. I'm looking forward to the call with you.
Yes, absolutely. And as we mentioned, we have a number of people who are in the chat room, the studio, and our Twitter feed. And so how can you be involved in any or all of those? And we are taking live callers tonight. I believe when you dialed into the studio, and that's 347-324-3591, you can simply press the 1 key to indicate that you have a question. Or if you'd like, you could go to our chat room. It's open right now. We have guests that are in that room now. You simply go to blogtalkradio.com/Texas-conflict-coach. You might need to scroll down, but you'll see the chat room is open, and you can enter there as a guest and pose your questions and comments there. And finally, if you're on the Twitter world, we're using the hashtag TCC Radio, T for Texas, C for Conflict, C for Coach, Radio, and you can also pose your question or comment there, and we have our graduate student intern who's monitoring that. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. And, John, let's just get right into it, because you've been involved in this field a long time. And so what for you was the motivating factor for writing your book, Peace at Work, for HR managers in particular?
Well, thanks for that great question, Patty. I'm of the view that each generation needs to reinterpret and in some senses hopefully add to the wisdom of the ages and sort of package it for their times. This is certainly not the first book to focus on workplace mediation, and it's also not going to be the last. And it's my hope that it's going to be my contribution to a more peaceful world. But it also represents a deeper question about my own life purpose, and in hindsight, I can sort of see how this book has been a long time coming. And if I may, I'd like to share a little story about my past, in particular my teenage years at school, and something that happened that informed a lot of what's gone into the book. But very basically, when I was at school, I didn't like getting into fights, and yet to my school friends, it seemed that fighting and the ability to win in a fight was one of the ways that you established yourself as a worthy male. And when I was about 15, I was put up to fight with another schoolboy, and I really didn't want to do it, but my pride was on the line. And so I finally agreed. But on the day in question, I basically chickened out, and I had to walk across what felt like the longest walk across the playing field and listen to the taunts of the other boys, basically calling me a coward. And obviously at that point in my life, it was a kind of a troubling experience. As I said, I knew I didn't like fighting, but I also didn't want to be a coward. And one thing as I reflect that I didn't do is I didn't speak to anyone about it. I just bottled it up. And I can sort of see how this question is tagged along with me through life. It influenced my career choice. I ended up studying law, although at the time I didn't really realize that I was learning a way to fight with words. And it was only after I came to the USA and trained as a mediator that I started to get some insight and get some answers. And one of them was that I was a conflict avoider. And not only that, I discovered that the shadow of being a conflict avoider is that you're sometimes passive-aggressive, and that was an embarrassing and hard thing to sort of to get in my life. But at least with that self-knowledge, it gave me choices. And I suppose I discovered I could change and I could show up without being an aggressor and without being a coward, and I could assert myself in a way that took care of my feelings and needs and generally kept the relationships intact. And I can see how this fundamental question about how to show up in life, not being the coward, not being the aggressor, has, as I say, it's been a life question, and it's very much part of the book that I wrote. So that really, in a way, was my motivation.
And that's a big motivation. We learn so much about how we manage and deal with conflict in our family lives as children growing up, and we have significant events, and it's always amazing because that significant event always feels like it just happened. We can remember it so vividly. We remember the emotions, the smells, the sense. All our senses are intact when we remember that, and looking, like you said, when you look back, you can see how that has impacted the choices you made, not only about your own personality and how you engage with people, but career choices. Now, listeners don't know, but where are you from originally? Because when you said you came to the U.S., what would listeners need to know about that?
Well, just that I was born in Durban, South Africa. So there was at that time was a country in a lot of turmoil. There was apartheid. And actually, I first moved to Namibia, and I was there for 8 years, and then I came from Namibia to the United States in 1996.
Very good. And you talk a lot about that in your book, in the beginning part of your book, about kind of some of that journey. And so I appreciate that you shared that in the book because it brings that rich experience from a different perspective. Now, in the nutshell, what is the core, then, essence of your book, and why do HR managers in particular need to read this?
Well, I think ultimately I see the book as a way of advancing my vision for peace at work. I like to believe that we can still have that dream of peace. And I want to make the skill of mediation available to all HR professionals that want to learn how to mediate. So in a sense, the book is really about, I suppose, showing HR professionals how they can mediate internal workplace conflicts themselves. I've tried to keep it simple and provide a lot of guidance on what they need to do and what they need to say. As you mentioned sort of a little earlier, the reality is that there is conflict in the workplace, and HR professionals are managing it all the time. And I think you and I, Patty, we know that folks can make conflicts worse, and there are also ways in which we can make them better. And I wanted to share with the HR world what I know about how to resolve workplace conflicts. And the other thing you also sort of alluded to in the opening was how often it is, and it often really amazes me, how HR professionals don't necessarily see mediation as a valid skill for themselves. In conversation, they'll often say things like, well, John, you're a mediator and I'm an HR professional, and they're sort of almost implying that there isn't an overlap. So in my view, we really need to educate the field of HR about the availability of this powerful and helpful tool.
Okay, so before we go into the book itself, because you talk about some very interesting elements that make quite a bit of sense, but from my own gut reaction is, thinking about HR people that I've worked with, they're going to be like, HR, mediator, oxymoron, HR is usually with management. How could they possibly be neutral in mediating? So I'm just going to kind of throw that out there before we go in, because you're going to talk about a mediation stance, but I could I could just hear people saying that doesn't even go together, So can you say a little bit about that?
Well, yes. In other words, I think too often we think of mediation as a formal process that takes place external to the organization. And it's true that it does. There's a lot of mediation taking place external to organizations, and we need a more, I would almost say, like a slightly more formal mediation process for that. But as we keep noting, the reality is that those conflicts that end up external to the organization started within the organization. And in my mind, HR folks often have an opportunity to effectively mediate, even if they're not calling it mediation. In other words, anytime they sit down together with, say, a manager and an employee, and they're trying to help sort something out, it might be a misunderstanding about a deduction that was made, or when leave is going to be given or taken, or something like that, and that HR manager in that moment has an opportunity of influencing that conversation in a positive direction, without saying I'm mediating or any of that. And that's that mediation stance that I tried to articulate in the book, is to really say you can take on the mindset and the attitudes of a mediator and just show up in that way, and it can make your world and life a whole lot easier.
So, in other words, how can HR managers see mediation, as you said, as a tool, which is really an opportunity for them to use all the various tools that they've learned to create this space to creating peace at work? So let's talk then about this mediation stance. What do you mean by this? Because you talk about it extensively in your book.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was thinking, remember I said about reinterpreting the wisdom and hopefully adding something new. I like to think that at least that articulation or description of the mediation is something new. But very basically, in mediation, you could almost say there are a number of key postures that are helpful to adopt, and that I've identified or described 9 different postures that I think are, as I say, are helpful. It's not so much like a physical posture, although the idea of the stance comes from my experience in martial arts, where people do assume stances to ready themselves for whatever is coming. So as I say, it's really more of the attitude and mindset of the mediator that the HR professional can take on, so that they can interact in a manner that supports collaboration and the emergence of creative solutions. And as I keep saying, it's like my sort of sense is that HR folks are doing this all the time. They're constantly interacting in a situation where there are 2 other folks, where they have an opportunity of applying, well, it's almost like the way of the mediator or the wisdom of the mediator, and helping them to work things out. But that would be basically it. Really, to me, it's about adopting the mindset and the attitude of a mediator in everything that they do.
So it's this body and mental postures, and I want to read this little excerpt it's actually on page 9 of chapter 2 of the Mediator Stance, and like you said, the stance is more of an attitude and mindset which ensures that you do no harm while supporting collaboration and the emergence of a creative solution. It prepares you to respond consciously in the moment when mediating, and allows you to mediate informally. And in order to do that in the moment consciously, there has to be this level of self-awareness. And so let's start to talk then a little bit about what this self-awareness is, because around some of these 9 elements. Can you give us an overview of what those 9 elements are?
Sure. Well, probably best I'll just read them through, in other words, just so that our listeners have a sense of what they are. But the first is that it's the real you showing up, the real self. So that's the first one. The authentic self is there, that you're not fake, you're not bluffing or pretending. So that to me is really foundational, and where we all need to start. So it's the real self showing up in a relaxed and calm manner. In other words, we're not agitated, we're not nervous, we're not angry, we're in a good emotional state. We're open to subtle information and feedback. In other words, if we are authentic and we are calm and relaxed, we're going to be able to pick up the more subtle information about what's going on. We're going to notice things. We're going to hear intonation and just get a better sense of what's really going on all the time. And this is the fourth: is that we constantly building rapport with both of the participants that we're working with. So we're an empathic rapport builder, and in my view, that's the elixir that the mediator is looking for, because it enables us to guide folks in conflict. That we're also balanced and omnipartial. In other words, we're equally there for everyone. And I know there are different words to describe that, neutral, impartial, and what have you. I think but that's essentially what we're getting at in my mind, is that people are we're balanced and omnipartial, that we're a collaborative process guide, not decision maker, and again, that to me is key in mediation, is that we're not the decision maker, but I think it's important for us to allow ourselves to influence the process as that collaborative guide. That we keep confidences. We're keepers of confidences. We respect differences in all shapes and forms as they come up. And ultimately, the ninth one is that we're an inspiring beacon of hope. So those are the basics.
What does that mean? Inspiring beacon of hope.
Well, I think the reality is a lot of times when folks are in some kind of a conflict situation, it can be somewhat depressing and feel hopeless. And they are often, I've certainly seen this in my mediations, people are ready to pack up their bags and leave, and I have to remind them that as long as I'm here, there's hope. And I think we ultimately sort of signal to the participants the possibility that they can have a resolution. In other words, if we start packing up our bags, then we're really signaling to them that there's no hope. So I think, especially as we're understanding through neuroscience and other research how emotional states are part of an open system, and then so we're influencing folks constantly. And so I think it's important as the mediator that we maintain a positive, hopeful outlook rather than being despondent and like doomsday and like, you guys are never going to work this out. I think it's part of our job to actually inspire and to say, I believe in you. I think you guys can work something out. That's why I'm here, to support you do. So to me, that's a big, that's really what that one's about, being an inspiring beacon of hope.
And I think it has to be genuine.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think with all, certainly with all emotion. And again, that comes back to the real self. In other words, we don't want to pretend. And if there's a way in which we need to express our reservations, we need to do that in an authentic way. But I still think we're tilting in certain directions, and one of them is to be hopeful.
So before we move on, let me just let the listeners know we have a number of people, again, in the chat room and our studio and Twitter feed, and thank you so much for joining us. We do encourage you to write your comments or questions that you have anything for John. Also, if you're in the studio itself, I believe it's the 1 key. Maybe it gave you a different direction, but I think it's the number 1 to let me know if you have a question or comment, and I'll open the line for you. Or we're using the Twitter feed, TCC Radio, hashtag TCC Radio. And actually, your Twitter name is the HR Mediator, so that's another way to reach out to John as well, is the HR Mediator. And so if you want to be part of that Twitter feed. So another thing that came up for me as you were talking about this mediator stance, and again, in this HR managers are to see and to use mediation as a valuable tool for them. And not so much, as you said, in this formal mediation sense, like a lot of us are professional mediators who that's all we do for a living, or the majority of what we do. And we're talking about how can these HR mediators or HR managers use this as a tool to create this space for peace at work and to be really genuine about it. And as you mentioned, there's a number of things that they really need to adopt in order to do that. What's the struggle, you think, for HR managers to adopt this mediator stance?
Yeah, well, I think one of them, I think they're all important, but I think probably the big one is that thing of who they're there for. I often sort of jokingly ask when I'm doing a presentation for HR professionals, whose side are you meant to take? It's a little bit of a trick question, because I think in the back of their heads they sometimes think that they're still meant to be there for management. And my view, and generally they agree with me, is that HR is meant to be there for everyone. So I think that's often the what really gets them into a bind, is that, for example, say a manager comes along to an HR professional and complains about an employee. And at that point, the HR professional has a choice as to how they respond. In other words, they could take the manager's side, in the sense of like, what's happened, and we're going to sort this out, and almost be an advocate for that manager, or they can adopt a stance and say, I hear you've got a perspective, and I also need to listen and hear what the perspective of that employee is. And I think the more that they can do that, the better. In other words, literally, as I say, be there for everyone, and that their job at that point is not to take sides. And I think when they do end up taking sides, in other words, they intimate to that manager that they're on their side, they're going to have difficulty trying to bring the employee into that conversation. And conversely, if that employee came to the manager, the HR professional first, and they did the same with that employee, they'd struggle bringing that manager in. So that, to me, as I say, is I see, when I've spoken to HR professionals, they'll describe themselves as being in the middle and being forced to take a side and getting pulled in different directions and just not knowing where to turn and what to do. And I think by adopting the stance, being balanced and omnipartial, and saying, you know what, you've all got perspectives and I'm here for you both, is a wonderful way for them to navigate and not to have that, the debilitating, nasty experience that they don't like.
So for those who are listening on the program who are in the HR field, what are some strategies in here that they could start really looking at to begin moving in that posture, that mindset, that attitude of a mediator stance?
Well, as I say, I think probably the one that I just mentioned, this thing of being balanced and omnipartial, to me, that is key. The other one that in other words, and that's a lot is to do with in their mind's eye, in other words, how they're showing up. But I think there's nothing like listening, and the fourth posture that I describe is empathic rapport builder. And to me, the fundamental way we build empathy with folks and rapport is through listening. So to me, whenever I speak to folks like yourself, Patty, or other mediators, we all tend to agree that listening is that, the vital skill that we can't do without. So to me, that would be where I would start. I would, when that manager came to me with the issue, I'd remind myself, I'm here for everyone. I'm not here to take your side, but I am here to support you, and I want to listen and understand what you're feeling about the situation, what you're needing, and and what you're hoping to accomplish. And then I explain to the person I'm going to speak to the other employee with whom that manager may have a concern, and I'm going to do exactly the same the same thing. I'm going to listen to that employee, make sure they feel understood, and then I can take it from there. Because when we listen well and we really hear what a person is experiencing, we develop rapport. And to me, as I said a little earlier, rapport is what enables us to guide people and to say things like, have you thought of doing this, or what about that? In other words, they're more open to our helpful guidance. But that would probably be just in a sort of that more nutshell kind of way. I'd say start with the balance and make sure you're doing a good job of listening to everyone. And just doing that can make a world of difference, because you'll often uncover misunderstandings that lead to mistrust, that lead to the conflicts. And if you get to it early, you can often unravel that and help people on their way. And again, that's what I've experienced over and over again in my career, working further away from the workplaces. I'd always sort of comment and think of how many missed opportunities there were, and I'd always be thinking, if only they'd taken the time up front early on to sit down and listen, what a world of difference that could have made.
And one of the big things, as you said, in building rapport is helping to build that trust. And especially for HR managers who are always, or many of them tend to struggle with people gaining trust. Are they confidential? Can we really go to them for help? And so this stance, if anything, will also help them to build that trust if they're in that real space that you're speaking about, in this neutral, balanced way, and really using empathetic listening, as part of that guidance. Any other Now, the book also, so basically the book, of course, talks a lot about the mediator stance, but what are the other things that HR managers, when they read this, what are they going to get from reading the rest of the book?
Well, for the rest, so the stance is really that informal, day-to-day, how you show up, how you can, as I say, just adopt that mindset of the mediator without anyone even realizing it. So there's that, and honestly, I think that's the biggest sort of, in many ways, the biggest opportunity in HR. But then there are also times where a situation will come to an HR professional's attention, especially for those folks that are in employee relations, where they realize that they have like there's a situation that really requires sitting down with these two employees and having a slightly more serious conversation and seeing if you can work something out in that manner. And so for those slightly more, let's say, more formal conversations, still within the organization, it's giving them the roadmap or the blueprint of how to go from, the beginning to the end. In other words, how to structure things in a way that you set yourself up for success and give the participants the best chance of working something out. So for the balance of the book, when I'm not attending to the mediation stance, it's really describing the mediation process from the opening statement or the opening phase of the process all the way through to the closing phase where you're documenting and writing up whatever agreements they have. And that I tried to do in a way that was I try to keep it as simple as possible, not to complicate things, and also to provide a lot of language and direction as to exactly what people can say at different points in time. So I try to keep it really practical in that manner.
Well, and it is a guide. And
exactly.
I like that. I like the fact that it is a guide. It gives that process. It breaks each of the phases around. You give some very specific examples, like the Harry and Sally case. And you also give some very specific forms, agreement samples, agreement to mediate samples or ground rules, et cetera, in the appendices. So it's a very user-friendly, very practical, easy to use, and adopt a number of the things where an HR manager can easily pick up and really help. But one of the biggest things that really stood out for me in reading this, I thought Chapter 2 was so significant. Even if they never did formal mediation or call it formal mediation, maybe it's facilitated dialogues, but how significant that can change the conversation by how they're showing up and helping both managers and employees deal with some of these situations, and how they can be such a catalyst for creating that space for people, and also creating that space for peace to happen. And so I really, really like that. Now, as we're almost to the closing, but I have another question, because what you and I were talking about is some of the changes that are happening in SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management, about these expectations and standards of HR managers in the field and how they're relating and dealing with conflict in working relationships. Can you tell us more about what these new expectations and standards are?
Yes, I can. It's something I'm really excited about. But very basically, in the field of human resources, there's for many years been SHRM, as you mentioned, the Society for Human Resource Management. It's the largest HR membership organization in the world. But there's also another organization, HRCI, that's the Human Resources Certification Institute, and they've been responsible for any number of years and considered by most as the gold standard for certification in human resources. And I know the folks in HR will know the PHR and the SPHR designations for professional human resource and senior professional human resource manager that have been around a long time. And so those, I think, for everyone thought that it was kind of settled until last year. SHRM came out and announced that there was going to be a new competency-based set of standards that are effectively in competition with the HRCI standards. So it's kind of interesting watching that conflict play out in the field itself. When I looked at the HRCI standards that lead to the PHR and the SPHR, they have a lot of focus, or put a lot of focus and attention on the investigation as a primary tool that HR professionals use. And obviously it's important, but they don't mention mediation in the context of internal workplace disputes, and the only time they do mention mediation is in the context of human resource professionals getting or hiring an external professional mediator. And as I say, then now comes along, I think it was last year in March, SHRM, and they basically, as I say, have overturned the apple cart, and what they've done is, rather than putting that emphasis external to the organization, they use mediation, the word mediation, all over the place, and they put the emphasis on relationship management, and they describe 9 core competencies, and they also break down whether the person is an early, mid-level, senior level, or executive level HR. And when I saw this, I just couldn't I literally couldn't believe it. Here's an example. For example, they say senior level HR professionals are expected to be able to, and these are their words, mediate difficult employee relations as a neutral party. So to me, this is a real game changer with this organization basically kind of coming out and endorsing the need for human resource professionals to know mediation. But if I can, I'd like to just mention a couple of more things, because at all levels they talk about the need to essentially be conflict management competent. They say, for example, at the entry level, folks are expected to be able to listen without immediately providing the solution, to prevent transactional conflicts, and when that's not possible, facilitating their resolution. So that's the early level. At middle level, they're expected to mediate difficult interactions and escalate problems when warranted, and also to facilitate conflict resolution meetings. And I already mentioned the senior level, but at the executive level, there's an expectation that they create conflict resolution strategies and processes throughout the organization. So, again, to me, I think it's going to be interesting to see how the spat between HRCI and SHRM plays out. But regardless, it's stirred things up, and it's really, as I say, endorsed and validated mediation as a tool for HR professionals.
Well, you are right on the right track in helping them and educating them, and this book will be a perfect alignment with this new core competency. I expect you'll be very busy in educating folks about that, and I think for a lot of us that's new information and very helpful to understand that SHRM is really supporting and saying you need to have this core competency. Professionals, don't be shying away from conflict, because, I find that a lot of HR managers do shy away from conflict. They can be just as conflict avoidant as the next person, and it's scary for them, and there's fear and anxiety about how that will turn out. And so I think what you've written is a great support, and they can do this. That's that, like you said, that beacon of hope. They can be that beacon of hope, and we can be that beacon of hope to say, yes, you can do this, and to have the courage, because, it came from your own earlier story about that feeling and the tauntingness of being a coward, and how can we be confident and courageous in dealing with conflict that really allows us to support and empower people to create a peaceful environment. So I'm so excited for you, and I'm excited about these changes. Thank you for sharing that with everyone here.
You're welcome, Patty, and thank you. Yeah, no, I think these are exciting times, so I certainly hope to make a difference. And,
well, you will, and you have been, John. I mean, especially with all those years of relationship that you had with mediate.com and all the work that you've done, not only here but in your own the country that you call home a lot of times in South Africa. And so we're very blessed to have you in our field and to go out and really change the world for the HR professional. So we are coming to a close, and we always, for our long-term listeners, we give assignments for the week or a call to action. So, John, what do you have for our listeners?
Well, I know that not everyone listening this evening is in HR, but for those of you that are, my sort of call to action or request is that you consider your ability to fulfill the relationship management responsibilities that you've been essentially tasked with by SHRM. So it's really to take a look at them, and if you didn't know about them, to take a look at them. And I would say if you are missing opportunities to mediate because of your discomfort with conflict, in other words, that being conflict avoidant like me, or even your inability to mediate, I'd basically encourage everyone to set developmental goals to take responsibility for that learning gap that you may have identified. I know that it'll help certainly in your workplace, but it'll also help your life. In other words, it'll improve the quality of your life by attending to relationship management skill sets. And to the rest, for those of you that aren't in HR, I'd say the same applies. In other words, we can always improve, and we'll look to ways to improve how we get along with others, how we manage our relationships, how we resolve our differences. So it's really a call to take stock of where are you, If you're good, that's good, and if you have some opportunities to improve, I'd say set yourself some goals and make a plan to accomplish that.
All right, very good. Now, where can folks, because you mentioned the SHRM competencies, where can they find that information?
Well, they can certainly get that. They can go to SHRM and get that. What I did was I pulled together a small little PDF handout where I basically focus in on the SHRM competency that looks at relationship management as it pertains to conflict engagement. So it's basically a 3-page handout that'll give people a very quick sort of overview of what's going on. To go beyond that, they'd need to go to the SHRM website and find it there. And to get that, and as you say, I'm more than happy for folks to download the full copy of the book that they can get at www.bit.ly/Patty Porter, and that Patty Porter is with capitals on the P's. But if folks go there, they'll be able to get the book and the 3-page handout. And obviously, my website's johnford.com and the HR Mediation Academy. But in terms of picking up these items, the bit.ly/Patty Porter page is the place to go.
And just to clarify, everyone, Patty is spelled PATTIEPORTER, so that you go to the right page. All right. So, John, what final message do you want to leave with listeners tonight?
All right. Well, I know that. At least my sense is with mass communication, the internet, and all of that, it seems like, I suppose, the world's become a smaller place, and especially at these times, at least in my view, I worry about our world, and it seems like things are getting worse. But at the same time, I also know that there's a lot of research that shows that things are actually getting better. So even though it seems like things are getting worse, statistically, we live in less violent times. At least that's what I'm told. And again, it comes back to being a beacon of hope. So I think it's important that we remain upbeat and encouraging. And actually, I just recently posted wrote something for mediate.com where it's really sort of saying, dare we imagine peace? Because I think it's kind of got to the point where people are even afraid to do that. So my encouragement is that everyone imagines peace as a possibility that looks to bring peace into their world and follows one of my great heroes' advice, Gandhi, who said, "You be the change you wish to see in the world." And so I'd say bring peace into your life, and that'll help us create this peaceful world that we all want to inhabit.
Wonderful, wonderful way to close that. Thank you, John, so much for joining us and being part of our radio program family. Thank you, everyone, for joining us in the chat room, studio, and Twitter feed. And if you need to reach out to John, again, johnford.com, and you can reach out to him through his email there. And again, thank you, everyone.
And thank you. I just want to quickly say to you, Patty, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful opportunity. I appreciate everything you do, and it's really been an honor to be on your show. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. All right, good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you for listening to the Texas Conflict Coach. We hope you've enjoyed the program. You can find over 300 podcasts archived to listen at your own convenience at texasconflictcoach.com. or download the podcast at iTunes or Stitcher Radio. To learn about upcoming radio programs and resources, sign up for our monthly e-newsletter.